So this is the third and the final presentation that will be shaped by Dr. Ben Botter. And we've been traveling with Ben over the past few weeks, and have addressed issues of gender and gender theory, and have explored a whole array of the consequences of considering gender more expansively and in more nuanced ways than often the tradition addresses, and discovering that there's more instability in the tradition around gender, particularly when talking about God. Thank you, Ben, for starting us on this third and last important conversation.
So in the first session, I talked quite a bit about gender theory and how it relates to the trans experience. And then last week in the second session, I sort of recounted my rather unusual personal experience. And today, really, I want to sort of pull these strands together and sort of talk about how these insights and this type of thinking might be relevant for both other trans and queer folks and for the Orthodox community. So let me share screen and go to what I hear, my little table of my little agenda. So right now doing the introduction. So I want to talk a little bit. So originally, for those of you who were there in the first session, I wanted to go back now to some thinking about my larger project of theorizing Jewishness with a toolkit of gender theory. I'm not going to do this because it's really important to me that we have some space for discussion later today. So that's why discussion is actually on the agenda here, more than the last two sessions. But I'd like to introduce a little about rhizome thinking, because that is relevant for the larger point I'd like to make. Then I'm going to talk a little about theological paradoxes, and then really sort of, if you want, the centerpiece or concluding piece of the whole this 3-week series, coherence, breaks in coherence, and how this might be a model in our thinking for validation and inclusion of trans people in Orthodox communities. So okay, let me stop share. Exactly, wonderful. So talk a little about this concept of rhizome thinking that is really by Gilles Deleuze, Philippe Guattari, from the 1970s. And it's not strictly gender theory, but it has been really useful in gender theory, and it's also useful in, I would say, in our thinking about Jewishness. So it is basically the concept to think about, sort of entities, phenomena like gender or Jewishness, not like something having a tree, like a binary thinking of a tree, but a rhizome. So the idea is that the tree has one trunk and multiple branches, and when the trunk falls or is cut or damaged, the whole plant dies. Rhizome is like ginger. It's a more integrated organism that continues to grow even if one part is or one section is cut off. It is much more difficult to uproot. It is not. It is different pieces are connected in different ways. They can exist independently and reconnect, grow into different systems. It's sort of an underground network that can sort of have different expressions. So this makes a lot of sense, I would argue, in our thinking about how Jewishness operates. And we've talked, I sort of named this a little in the first session. So it can be peoplehood, ethnicity, religion, culture, secular identity, sort of feminist modes, new age of Jewishness, Jewish Buddhists. There are early modern conversos who returned to Judaism after centuries. So there's sort of these converso cultures. So Jewishness is really constantly changing, shaping, revising its boundaries, revising its meanings. So And when we think about Jewishness this way, as a rhizome, that helps certainly explain why the Jewish people or Jewishness, Judaism as a formation has lasted for so many centuries, is much harder to destroy. It is not one definition really. It does not have one center and one definition. And there's never an original way or even an exact replication or understanding of its essence and its features. So that is a type of thinking that has been tremendously useful in gender theory, and I think it's useful for our understanding of Jewishness too. So like for gender, there's no single answer to the question of how Jewishness or the category Jewish operates. It is not a tree with a trunk, but it's a decentered, multivalent organism. So, and it seems that the very nature of Jewishness is that its workings cannot be reduced. So I'm saying this might be the very nature, the essence. This is not just sort of there's the definition. So the definition of Jewishness is that there is not one definition. There's not one mode, one meaning, one origin, one formula, one truth. It is not one thing. So, and that, of course, relates to the fact that then one statement is true in one context, and then the opposite statement is another context, and they're both, seem mutually exclusive, but they're part of this fabric, this rhizome entity, very, very similar to gender. Gender can also be all sorts of things, but instead of so moving now to the to the theological paradox. I mean, on one hand, we know this type of thinking from rabbinic textuality. So it is not one thing. There's not one answer. There's not one truth. It's this sort of shifting organism that somehow holds together, but also is sort of so lively and both lively and lasting because of this flexibility, because there's not one trunk that is, that where everything depends on. And of course, this type of paradox, and let me do the screen sharing again, also finds expression in Jewish theological conceptions about God and creation. So let me move to the other screen here. So now just sort of a few sort of principles that really are not particularly original. The concept that creation is both a veil and a manifestation of God. On the one hand, of course, where there's the concept of tzimtzum in the beginning, in the Kabbalistic account, but the idea is that where material reality is sort of displaces God somewhat, where on the other hand, it is a manifestation of God. There's always, and of course, let me see, the Kabbalistic concept, Ein od milvado, there is nothing, there can be nothing outside of God. So all creation is also always a manifestation of God. Of course, it's the similar paradox, sort of a statement, truth, that God is both immanent, always present everywhere and everything, intimately close to each of us, and at the same time transcendent and unreachable. Again, nothing, sort of very shocking or new. And of course, I can't help myself but include some Ibn al-Arabi here. For those of you who don't know, I've been, he's a Sufi master, 13th century Spain, very much the same cultural context that what scholars claim are the authors of the Zohar. So these guys have been clearly talking to each other. And there's also Ibn al-Arabi has this beautiful statement that the nafs, the self or the ego, both obstructs God and is a sign of God. So same, I mean, of course, sign, and who knows what this is in Arabic and the exact meaning. But the same thing that we are sort of our self, our ego, the way we operate is both sort of in the way of God, and it is of course part of God. And I would, and this is really, I mean, say we can all of these concepts, all of this thinking can be expanded, stretched, really in saying that God resides in both the coherence of the world and in breaks of coherence. So, and we've been talking quite a bit about coherence in the past 2 weeks. And for all of us, but also particularly the newcomers, I'd like to go, so just sort of bring into our consciousness again some of the main concepts we've been talking about. So we first talked about the queer theory idea concept, that gender coherence is produced through a web of words, gestures, dress, acts. So we said gender coherence is the effect of performativity. So the what we perceive as reality, as real men and women, is the effect of all these sort of reality established through this to the sum of language and other signs. And in this reading, transgender experience is a break in coherence. It is a where this coherence sort of ruptures, where there's a tension, and where all of a sudden it becomes, and we've talked about this quite a bit, or I talked about it quite a bit, sort of the mechanism that usually establishes coherence becomes visible because it's sort of exposed because because it's not sort of self-evident. And then last week I talked about my own experience, and that was really also as where the concept of coherence was at the center. We really talked about a rupture of coherence associated with trauma, and in some connection, and that is really sort of discussable, and I'm still obviously open to thinking in and not so obvious. So this rupture of coherence and trauma in some connection with my unstable gender identity, my transgender experience, and this opening into radiance below the surface of creation. So this, what you might want to call a mystical experience. So I'd summarize this by into saying, so what we've seen here, the coherence, what we perceive as reality of our world is fragile. And we can, in transgender experience, mystical experience, and we talked about this too, mental illness are all breaks in coherence. They are breaks in our reality. And there are, of course, other breaks of coherence of reality too. I mean, birth and death are always sort of breaks in the surface of our reality. I've seen at the beginning of the pandemic, when sort of our reality shifted. I mean, I've people, more than one people are talking about how unreal this is, what was going on, how so our reality is sort of a thin surface, is fragile. Coherence is fragile. And of course, behind the surface of our realities, the ultimate reality is God, beyond. So the question is now, sort of, if you want the most important pieces, the main pieces of my thinking and what I've been presenting here has been laid out, and the question is now, of course, where do we go from here in practical terms? What does this mean? All these, models and thinking, and these sort of our pondering realities for Orthodox Jewish communities. And I actually think that really the sort of rabbinic literature, the Talmudic paradigm, can be a model here. And it was Rabbi Shefner last week who asked about the trans figures, transgender identities in Talmudic literature. So I actually don't completely remember the exact phrasing, but of his question. But when I think about how Talmudic literature deals with the reality, if you want, the strategy of the Talmud, it is a dominant binary framework of men and women, heterosexual couples, family, reproduction. I mean, that is clearly the framework, and that is the framework into which sort of these transgender figures are also sort of folded in, or they accommodated, but they are there. So transgender figures, multiple genders are acknowledged and validated. So that is, so this is really the rabbinic model. And I would sort of just expand this a little, or rephrase this slightly, saying that family, community, the coherence of a shared social reality is the framework. And breaks of coherence are part of the picture and have a function. So both is there. This coherence of the man, women, family, community, social reality framework, and the breaks in coherence. So basically, I think about this relationship between this dominant binary framework and the transgender experience, if you want, like the relationship, for example, between halachic Judaism and mysticism, between rabbinics and Kabbalah. So you have, there was actually, like a while ago, I would have argued that Gershom Scholem's Judaism, that is this purely mysticism, the subterranean strand of the Jewish people mission, that it would not have survived. Having thought a little more about the rhizome, sort of this rhizome concept of Judaism, it might have survived. And actually, when you think about Soviet Jewry, when you think about conversos who sort of Jewishness survived for a few centuries, so who knows, right? But it's very, very clear. But it's clear that these sort of configurations of Judaisms are much poorer. So it is very, very clear that sort of rabbinic Judaism, coupledom, children, family, community, this coherent social fabric is crucial, maybe not central. I mean, that's something to, we can think about. But certainly, that is the fabric of, certainly in the fabric of Jewish life, certainly sort of in the universe of Orthodox Judaism. But then there's Kabbalah. Mysticism has a place too. Awareness and immersion into divine, even, we've talked about this last week, Bitul Hayesh, transness, liminal experiences, traveling borderlands. So they're both, they're part of this rhizome structure. And it's not always clear there's not one center, and it's, depend on how you look and where you how you approach it and how you argue it, and from the when and where. And also, what is really crucial, it is not either or, and it is not one more than the other. There's no, I would argue, for no hierarchy of experiences or hierarchy of sacredness. So, and of course, most Orthodox trans and gay people, lesbians, want to fit into the Jewish patriarchal familial norm, into this, what is in this context, the figures as a mainstream. And I remember, maybe some of you too, so Miriam Karbakov in some public setting, where there was a question about sort of gay lesbian life, and she was sort of spoke out how about her lesbian life looks like, and basically about getting up in the morning and making breakfast and getting the children to school, etc., etc. So this really desire to be part of this what I call this dominant framework of community and family. And that is, of course, good, because this norm is beautiful and rich and meaningful, and it certainly has played, maybe if not the central, then certainly an important role to the survival of Judaism and Jewish people. However, trans and queer people often do not quite fit. Sometimes we are not quite coherent. Sometimes we are not quite at home on the surface, on the fabric of this world. And then often we are thought of and we are think of ourselves as failing to fit. And my central point, if you want, is that this is not a failure. Our rupture in coherence is not a failure. We live in a place that is also awesome and rich. It is not either or. Our place is not easy, it's often painful, it's confusing, and many of us have terrible experiences with family and community. But it's not either or. Both the patriarchal, heterosexual norm is a place of radiance and divine presence and manifestation of God, and the trans and queer rupture of this norm is a place of radiance and divine presence. And that is my pitch for the day.
What an incredibly beautiful and poignant portrayal, not only of the opportunities that are in front of us, but in regard to how communities might embrace or address trans presence, but about a form of Jewish life that allows for the appearance of incoherence as a site of divinity, as a site of inspiration. I think that there are many of us, not only trans people, who would find that theology appealing, even if we're largely, most of the time, just getting up in the morning and getting our children off to school. I want to begin because I think that there, those of us here who are both, sharing your experience in various and different ways, that ought to be first in line to kind of respond to it. So I'm going to hold off my curiosities for a minute and welcome anybody else, either they're on this call or parents of trans kids and trans people, as well as people who are just concerned with the challenges that communities face in regard to these questions, and I certainly am one of those. So questions, comments, thoughts, please just join the conversation.
Yeah, there are a number of categories. There's the androgynous, there are the two types of saris, there's the tumtum, there's ayunit. I mean, there's a whole little village of the language would today be a non-binary, figures. So yes, and they're there. And they're both. I mean, that's the tension in the text, right? They're both acknowledged, they are in some ways validated. They have a sort of respectable place. I mean, less respectable, but there are all sorts of figures who are sometimes less respectable. And in this binary framework, there's no, but both the male female and the in the sort of community family is central. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so there's a whole, but we have these, and and it seems that that's where we are headed in also Orthodox communal life. And I suppose and not only, I mean, in society overall, I mean, sort of the heterosexual family is not going to disappear with the existence of more, a more lively, both, culture of gender, sort of gender identities and so on. Just another comment, something that I said in the first session also. I mean, gender theory in the 70s, some of the, one of the utopian goals was, that there needs to be the end of gender. Gender is obviously tied up with hierarchy, and the utopia was, getting rid of gender. I mean, then came, sexuality study, and, sex is much less fun without gender. But also, I mean, in reality, this opening up of both the destabilization of gender theoretically and this opening up of multiple gender identities today has not brought the end of gender. And it has not brought the end, and it's not going to bring the end of the heterosexual family. I mean, maybe that is going to be one of the main challenges in the Orthodox setting also, is to sort of convince people that this is not a challenge, that this is not sort of the system is quite stable. It has been stable for a few thousand years. It's not going to go away and in pre-modern settings there were way gender identities were way more flexible, were way more fluid in the early modern period, for example, and there's no reason to think that any of this is threatening. The Talmud wasn't scared of it, and there's no reason why we should be scared of it.
Right. I mean, the challenge is that Orthodox communities have replaced a halachic ability to tolerate incoherence with a bourgeois inability to tolerate incoherence. That many modern Orthodox communities are just they're hard pressed to think of halacha as as anything but a kind of an almost a dogmatic frame for absolute coherence. And so the real challenge is, I would like to translate this into real progress, if we could, is that what of your thinking do you think might be relevant for example, for SAR High School? How do we allow, and maybe, Russ, you can address this question or think it through with us, what of this conceptualization might land, in a place like, a wonderfully binary and bourgeois community like Riverdale, land in a way that feels religiously alive rather than threatening, heretical, fearsome?
I would love to hear, Russell, if you want to talk about how this resonates with you, for you. Whether any of this is sort of meaningful and could move into a direction of application.
Right. It's hard to answer, honestly, because I don't, how do I say this? My limited, sort of window into the Orthodox world, because again, it's there are different communities and different institutions and different, worlds within that world. I I find there is this tension between, sort of sensitivity and politicized, ideology and for example, when I spoke to teachers about a student's request to use non-gendered pronouns, somebody very, innocently and well-intentioned, asked, is this part of a student's like sort of ideology? Is this a person who is trying to, be, pro-feminist or anti-patriarchy or something like that? Or is this coming from a place of identity, for this particular student? Which I don't fault them for asking the question, because that's usually the first reaction I find in the Orthodox world is, and I guess I should say in the modern Orthodox world, where I find a lot of people are open-hearted and want to be inclusive and understand that people need a home within the Orthodox world and the traditional Jewish world, but are also at first, at first pass, like a little bit skeptical or judgmental of the motivation behind it, or something like that. Now, the other thing that I would say that struck me was in talking to people about a student who wants to be gender neutral. I misgender all the time, when I'm talking about that student, and I correct myself as often as I can, and that kind of thing. And it struck me that it is, at this stage in the game, it's a bit of a halting, awkward conversation to have, in the same way that it feels halting and awkward when I or people try to talk about God without gendering God. When I say God instead of he, because I don't want to sort of imply that I'm sort of talking about a personified or anthropomorphized or gendered God. That's not what I'm talking about. It gets clunky at times, just saying God instead of using a pronoun. And I find that, that was my experience of it. And I kind of had this thought in my mind, like, that's almost like an in, for people in the Orthodox world, for people with a traditional or religious sensibility, that's a way of sort of showing, like, we use these shorthands to try to capture who someone or something is, because we're in a hurry, or because that's our comfort level, or because, we've never really learned or been taught or encouraged to challenge it. But those labels that we use so easily are so limiting, and often don't really capture like the whole person that you're talking about or anything like that. So it struck me that, by pointing out that when we talk about God in this way, that's very limiting and very, and no, I don't think anybody with a religious sensibility would say, a name of God is or a pronoun that you use to refer to God captures it, or is adequate. And it struck me like that might be a nice opening for a conversation in the Orthodox world about people and gender too. So I don't know if that answers your question, honestly. I feel like I rambled a little bit.
No. Ben, you want to respond?
But I mean, one thing that is of course fascinating is it's happening. I mean, you have trans kids in Orthodox high schools and they're there. So, so unless, you want to sort of exclude a whole segment of the population, and it's so, and obviously it's, I mean, so that's just very, very interesting. Things are shifting. I'm sort of chewing a little on this. I know what you get, what you're saying in terms of the sensitivity versus politicized. I'm chewing a little bit, of course, on this dichotomy, right? And what might help is, of course, that, I mean, and of course, in some ways, from some perspective, of course, it's politicized, right? Of course it is. I mean, of course it's political, and of course there's a new language out there. So, but this thinking that all self is shaped by culture, and now there's a language out there, and I would actually say again, because that is sort of an awareness that was, I mean, from the historical perspective, really suppressed, in Europe. I mean, in Europe with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, that there's more than binary gender, and gender is more fluid and it's more complicated and so on. And again, the Talmud knew that, right? So, is this their true self? Is this who they, does it come from their, from who they are, or are these outside labels that they took on, right? I mean, that's really the question. And to understand that that's a meaningless dichotomy. Like our self is made up of, with a cultural vocabulary that we have. So that is available to us. Yeah.
I think the fear, though, is a real one. The fear is a real one that Russ articulating, because I even feel it myself. Is there's a political agenda, and there's a sensitivity, and there's the what is apparent in the tradition, and people are experiencing, whether it's true or not, right? They're experiencing the kind of end of gender idea that you suggested was in the 70s and 80s. They're experiencing it now. That their worry is that something human is being given a kind of a bludgeon to basically demolish and vilify halacha, and so that's so that they want to be sensitive to a kid struggling, but they want to hold the line on what appears to be a kind of, fundamental rejection of all norm, of all binary operations. And I don't know if that would work, Russ, if there was this affirmation that it doesn't need to be sensitivity or ideological transformation, but can really be religious inspiration too. But I'm wondering if what you've done for anyone here, Ben, if what you've done, do you think could be put on some form of it, could be put on the actual website as kind of like the sacredness of incoherence, of how sometimes not knowing is where we are, even expresses itself in halachic norm.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you tell me whether this is helpful for you, but I'd like to make sort of a few comments in conclusion. I mean, Stephen, there was this, we touched on the question really of the nature of Jewish difference. Sort of, and and in some ways it is very similar to what we've talking before and what I've been trying to, promote with the Rhizome, like to go beyond dichotomies, binaries, simply truth. Jews, I mean, and what I'm saying, Jews have always, I mean, what I say, Jewishness is a performance of difference in the language of the environment. It is Jews, there is no Jewishness without sort of the culture of non-Jew, like non-Jews around them. It is, I mean, we are always a particular sort of twist on the non-Jewish culture around us. And that creates a stunningly, I mean, that this creates coherence. It's sort of, if you want the sort of the magic of Jewishness, what the sort of the mystery of how this, configuration of Jewishness works. I mean, so I can't help, sort of making this comment, expanding on this. Then Leonard, what you've talked about these different texts and how, from the rabbinics to, to Kabbalistic ideas and so on. I mean, there's a universe to be explored. This, as you say yourself, we are just at the very beginning. I mean, there's awesome stuff out there, and we're going to, I mean, we're going to write it and it's going to go forward and it's going to unfold. And and it's happening already. I mean, I'm not sure where you heard this teaching, but it's out there and it's going to happen. From my, if I want to put it on the very large, perspective, the project that we're engaged in is undoing the damage of modernity. These very sort of narrow definitions, like sort of ideas of truth, of unitary, of binary gender identities, of simple dichotomies, so that have become part of Judaism. They're part of, and in particular, modern Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodoxy is shaped by Enlightenment 19th century philosophy. So that is, and we are currently moving beyond that. And it opens up, I mean, I would actually argue what is happening here is making this fabric of Jewishness and Jewish practice and Jewish life more Jewish, if anything. Because this multivalence and, I mean, what I call the shininess, I mean, both this dazzling, complexity and multifariousness of Jewishness that is in the text, has always been in text, and has been sort of narrowed down in these Western ideas, 19th century, like 1890 Enlightenment of truth. So, and gender is one of the areas where we have sort of the opportunity to open this up again and make it sort of, and make it richer and more beautiful and more, as I would like to say, radiant. So
I just want to, people have to go, but I just want to say that last sum up was marvelous and gave me some goose pimples. I am sure that there's much to be gleaned from an exploration of coherence and the parallels between gender and Judaism, just as an open question in yeshiva high schools, would be a marvelous, even if we didn't even directly immediately associate it with gender, just giving people just a more relaxed and kind of experience of Jewish belonging that did not undermine but expanded it to be just less, as you just described, stuck in modern categories. And so with that, I'm going to just thank you so much for this incredible gift. And we're going to continue to play with these ideas and hopefully ask you to return at some point to help us think through how some of this could be structured pedagogically for high school kids or maybe even earlier, and for us to actually move forward with this series of inquiries in ways that are enlightening and, as you say, shiny. So thank you so much, and I look forward to more. So everyone have
thank you.
A sweet Rosh Hashanah and a sweet Yamim Naraim, and maybe all find opportunities for transformation and enlightenment and the self audit that leads to joy, and hopefully things will get better over time in regard to kind of like our world of boxes as opposed to people, and we can be in each other's presence, God willing, very soon.